41 years after Korean Airlines Flight 007 vanished into the Sea of Japan, deep-sea divers just found it, and what they discovered has rewritten Cold War history. The wreckage was supposed to be unrecoverable, too deep, too dangerous. The Soviet Union claimed they never found the black boxes. Russia insisted the crash site was a military exclusion zone. For 4 decades, the world accepted a simple story. A navigation error sent a civilian airliner into Soviet airspace, a tragic mistake during Cold War tensions. 269 people died because of pilot error and geopolitical paranoia. But this month, an autonomous underwater vehicle captured something 1,700 feet below the surface that proves we were lied to. The fuselage shows impact damage from 2 missile strikes, not one. Are deployed, proving people survived the ditching. And the flight data recorder, recovered intact, shows the pilots were following air traffic control instructions the entire time. Korean Airlines 007 didn't stray off course by accident. It was guided into Soviet airspace deliberately, and when it was shot down, survivors were left in the water to die while Soviet naval vessels watched. The black boxes Russia claimed didn't exist have been in Moscow's archives for 41 years, and what they contain is about to trigger an international crisis. The discovery came on January 14, 2025. A joint Japanese-South Korean oceanographic expedition using next-generation autonomous ROVs was mapping undersea topography off Monaran Island when sonar detected a massive debris field at 1,850 feet. The signature was unmistakable, a Boeing 747 fuselage section, largely intact, resting on a silt bed that had protected it from decades of current erosion. Within 72 hours, the ROVs had photographed the entire crash site. What they found contradicts every official report from 1983. The tail section shows catastrophic damage from a missile detonation, standard air-to-air kill. But the forward fuselage, 300 feet away from the tail, shows a second impact pattern, shrapnel scarring across the port side consistent with a proximity-fused warhead. Korean Airlines 007 was not hit by 1 missile, it was hit by 2, and the second missile struck after the aircraft had already begun its emergency descent. When weapons forensics experts from Japan's National Research Institute for Earth Science and Disaster Prevention analyzed the high-resolution imagery, they identified the specific damage signatures. The first missile, an R-98 from the Su-15 interceptor, detonated near the tail section at 18,000 feet. Catastrophic, but not immediately fatal. The aircraft would have been controllable for descent. The second missile signature shows a different detonation pattern, smaller warhead, lower altitude, consistent with a surface-to-air system firing on a descending target. Dr. Kenji Yamamoto, who led the forensic analysis, describes the implications in stark terms. The physical evidence is unambiguous. This aircraft was engaged twice. The second strike occurred at an altitude between 4,000 and 6,000 feet. KAL 007 was trying to ditch when it was hit again. The official Soviet report from 1983 mentioned only a single R-98 fired by Major Gennady Osipovich. The existence of a second engagement was never disclosed. September 1, 1983, 1:46 a.m. local time, Korean Airlines Flight 007, a Boeing 747 carrying 240 passengers and 29 crew, departs Anchorage International Airport bound for Seoul, South Korea. The flight is routine, the aircraft is one of Korean Air's newest 747s, the weather is clear, Captain Chun Byung-in is an experienced pilot with over 10,000 flight hours. First Officer Sun Dong-hui is equally qualified. Flight engineer Kim Dong completes the crew. The passengers include families, business travelers, and United States Congressman Larry McDonald. The flight plan calls for a standard Great Circle route across the North Pacific, passing south of the Kamchatka Peninsula and descending into Seoul. It is a route Korean Air flies multiple times per week. Nothing about Flight 007 suggests this will be anything other than a routine overnight crossing. 2 hours and 40 minutes into the flight, something goes wrong. Korean Airlines 007 begins deviating from its assigned airway. The deviation is gradual, first 50 miles north of course, then 100, then 200. By the time the aircraft approaches Soviet airspace, it is 365 miles off its filed flight plan. It crosses directly over the Kamchatka Peninsula, one of the Soviet Union's most sensitive military zones, home to ballistic missile submarine bases and strategic radar installations. Soviet air defense radar tracks tracks the aircraft for over 2 hours. MiG-23s scramble from Petropavlovsk Air Base but fail to intercept. The Boeing 747 continues westward, exiting Kamchatka airspace and flying over international waters before entering Soviet territory again over Sakhalin Island. At 3:15 a.m., a Soviet Su-15 interceptor piloted by Major Gennady Osipovich locks on to Korean Airlines 007. Soviet ground control orders him to force the aircraft to land or shoot it down. For 9 minutes, Osipovich follows the 747. He fires warning bursts from his cannons. The tracers streak past the cockpit windows. Soviet doctrine requires visual identification. Osipovich reports seeing the aircraft's navigation lights. He describes it as a large 4-engine aircraft with standard navigation lights. But ground control insists it is an American RC-135 reconnaissance plane. The order comes at 3:26 a.m. Destroy the target. Osipovich fires 2 R-98 missiles. The first detonates near the tail section. Korean Airlines 007 begins an emergency descent. Captain Chun broadcasts a distress call. Korean Air 007 experiencing rapid decompression, descending to 10,000. The transmission cuts off. 3:29 a.m. All contact with Flight 007 ceases. 269 people are dead. The story the world was told seemed straightforward. Korean Airlines 007 strayed off course due to a navigation error. The crew failed to properly program the aircraft's inertial navigation system, allowing the autopilot to fly a constant magnetic heading instead of following the Great Circle route. The aircraft drifted north into Soviet territory. Soviet air defenses, on high alert due to recent NATO reconnaissance flights, mistook the civilian airliner for a military spy plane, a tragic accident fueled by Cold War paranoia and poor communication. The Soviet Union initially denied shooting down any aircraft, then admitted it but claimed they had no way of knowing it was civilian. The United States accused the Soviets of deliberate murder. The United Nations condemned the attack. Families buried their dead and the world moved on. Except the story was a lie from the beginning. Declassified NSA intercepts from 1993 revealed that Soviet ground control explicitly identified Korean Airlines 007 as a civilian aircraft multiple times during the intercept. Transcripts of communications between ground control and Major Osipovich include exchanges where controllers state the target is a civilian Boeing and navigation lights consistent with commercial traffic. Osipovich himself reported seeing a large 4-engine aircraft with standard navigation lights. Soviet doctrine required visual confirmation before engaging civilian aircraft. That confirmation was obtained and ignored. The shoot-down was not a mistake, it was a deliberate act. But what the ROV cameras captured 1,700 feet below the surface proves the deception goes even deeper. The deployed emergency slides. When the expedition's ROVs mapped the wreckage field, they found multiple emergency evacuation slides in deployed condition. These slides are housed in sealed compartments in the aircraft doors and deploy automatically when the doors are opened in emergency mode or when they contact water. The fact that slides are deployed means the aircraft ditched relatively intact and passengers attempted to evacuate. Korean Airlines 007 did not disintegrate in midair. It descended to the ocean's surface. People survived the impact. They got out of the aircraft, and then they died in the water because no one came to help them.
Leaked Soviet naval logs obtained by the expedition team tell the rest of the story. On September 1st, 1983, at approximately 3:45 a.m., Soviet rescue vessels were dispatched to the crash coordinates. The logs, translated from Russian archives and released this month, include entries describing survivors observed in water and life rafts deployed from wreckage. But the orders those vessels received were explicit. Maintain observation position. Do not initiate rescue operations. Await further instructions. For at least 90 minutes, Soviet ships circled the crash site while survivors floated in 40-degree water. By the time American and Japanese rescue aircraft arrived at dawn, there were no survivors. The water temperature would have caused hypothermia and death within 2 hours. The Soviet vessels watched it happen. The flight data recorder recovered by the ROV expedition has not yet been publicly released. Japan and South Korea are negotiating with international aviation authorities over jurisdiction, but sources familiar with the data describe contents that contradict 4 decades of official narrative. The FDR shows Korean Airlines 007's inertial navigation system functioning normally throughout the flight. The autopilot was engaged and following programmed waypoints. The deviation from the flight plan was not caused by crew crew error or equipment malfunction. According to the data, the aircraft was following air traffic control vectors. Someone on the ground was feeding the crew false position information, guiding them north into Soviet airspace while making them believe they were on course. The FDR timestamps match declassified NSA signals intelligence showing unusual radio transmissions from Anchorage air traffic control during Korean Airlines 007's departure, transmissions that originated from a frequency allocation not used by civilian ATC. The cockpit voice recorder, also recovered intact, contains the crew's final minutes. Sources who have reviewed the recording describe Captain Chun and his crew calmly executing an emergency descent after the first missile strike. The aircraft was controllable. Landing gear was deployed for ditching. Crew were preparing the cabin for water impact. The recording captures the sound of a second explosion at low altitude, then screaming, then silence. The second missile strike occurred when Korean Airlines 007 was at 4,000 feet, fully committed to an emergency ocean landing that likely would have resulted in dozens of survivors. The Soviet military finished what the first missile started. The KAL 007 wreckage has triggered what intelligence analysts are calling the most significant Cold War revelation in 30 years. If the flight data recorder proves the aircraft was deliberately guided off course, it implicates multiple parties in an international conspiracy. If Soviet naval forces documented survivors and were ordered not to rescue them, it constitutes war crimes. And if the United States possessed signals intelligence showing the guidance deception in real time and said nothing, it means Washington knew Korean Airlines 007 was being set up and allowed it to happen. The geopolitical implications are staggering. Russia's foreign ministry has declined to comment on the expedition findings, citing insufficient verification of claims. South Korea has formally requested access to all Soviet-era archives related to the incident. The United States Department issued a statement calling for full transparency and international cooperation in investigating new evidence. But behind closed doors, according to leaked diplomatic cables, all three governments are scrambling. The wreckage proves the official story is false. The black boxes will prove who is responsible, and 41 years of carefully constructed narrative is about to collapse.
For the families of the 269 victims, the discovery brings validation and rage. They were told their loved ones died in a terrible accident. They were told the pilots made a fatal error. They were told recovery was impossible. All of it was lies. The aircraft was guided into a trap. It was shot down deliberately. Survivors were left to die, and the black boxes that could have exposed the truth were hidden in Russian military archives while the world was told they were lost forever. The expedition team plans to recover the flight recorders within the next 60 days. International maritime law and aviation treaties require Russia to cooperate in the recovery and analysis. Whether Moscow will comply remains uncertain, but the physical evidence is already incontrovertible. 2 missile strikes, deployed emergency equipment, intact wreckage showing controlled ditching. Korean Airlines 007 did not vanish into the ocean because of pilot error or Cold War confusion. It was murdered by Soviet military forces, acting on orders that came from the highest levels of government. And when people survived the shootdown, they were left to freeze and drown while rescue vessels watched. The question that haunts investigators now is simple. Who gave the order to guide Korean Airlines 007 into Soviet airspace? And who decided that 269 innocent people were acceptable collateral damage in whatever intelligence operation required sacrificing a civilian airliner? The wreckage has exposed a 41-year lie. The black boxes will expose who told it. And the world is about to discover that the Cold War's most infamous aviation disaster was not an accident of history, but a deliberate act of mass murder that 3 governments conspired to hide. If this revelation about Cold War deception shocked you, hit subscribe. We're uncovering more stories where the official history hides the truth.